welcome to the MessianTic podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome to the Messianic podcast. I'm Rabbi Eric. I'm joined by Rabbi David, Rabbi Toby, and Rabbi Jonathan, and we're going to have a discussion that came as a result of a recent guest at our synagogue. We had Mark Vidido come and share at our synagogue about a project he's working on, and the project is called They Called Him Yeshua. And I don't want to necessarily focus on his project, although the purpose of his project is to chronicle the testimony of the early Messianic leaders of this restored Messianic movement. People like Paul Wilbur, Stuart Dowerman, Joel Chernoff, Martha Stern, and many others. And as I dealt with this project that he's doing, where he's doing these videos recording the testimony of these people, it made me think as somebody who's just below that group. So I'm just younger than that group of people, yet I'm with a table full of rabbis who are the next generation behind me. And it really made me think about what will the Messianic movement look like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, when these pioneers are no longer around. They're no longer leading, directing. They're no longer part of the boards. They're no longer part of the group's leadership of the main organizations. And how does it look 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? What will happen to the Messianic Jewish movement? And in this particular episode, I'm going to do my best not to talk as much as I do in other episodes, because I really want to hear from the younger leaders what they think it's going to look like, and not only what they think it's going to look like, but is it positive or negative in their thoughts or hearts as that happens. In other words, change isn't necessarily bad if it brings around blessings and progress and advancement. But with these leaders who have led and in many ways controlled the direction of the movement and the organizations, as they're no longer there because of either retirement or going to be with the Lord, what happens to the Messianic Jewish movement next? So I'm going to throw that out, and whichever one of you wants to jump in first, feel free to jump in, and let's just have a discussion about what it may look like and what we see happening over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on.
So I'm gonna dive into this one kind of early on in the Messianic movement for, I guess, 20-something years now, and have been in congregational leadership for the last 20 years, 22 years, something like that, in some form or another, and have kind of dealt with a lot of the headache of what it means to be a younger leader trying to find a foothold, trying to find a place in the movement, and some of the headaches that go with that. Because I think in a lot of ways, yes, the pioneer generations have, I can't say enough to honor what some of these people have done in putting Messianic Judaism on the map, where it is and how influential it is. And even the fact that, and if we're honest about it, the fact that so many churches are kind of diving into a deeper understanding and realization of the Jewish context of Scripture, the Jewish context of Yeshua as Messiah, really is to the credit of the early pioneers of the Messianic Jewish Alliance, the UMJC, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, to Jews for Jesus, Chosen People Ministries, Jewish Voice, and so on and so forth. These people that have literally put blood, sweat, and tears into seeing this movement become what it is today, which is a really substantial presence now. But I've also watched as a lot of the pioneers, the older generation of leaders that I've grown up under, that I've learned from, that I have revered and respected for the majority of my life, have also in some ways kind of held on to the pulpit, held on to leadership roles, held on to things with kind of a death grip, with a vice. out of fear that the younger people coming up, all they want to do is take our pulpits, all they want to do is take our roles, all they want to do is take this, that, and the other. And that's not everybody that has that attitude, but it is a prevalent enough attitude that it has caused a lot of disparity for younger people with a desire to be in leadership roles, with a calling to be in leadership roles in the movement. But I can tell you, I've been in this long enough that I've watched how the younger generations, myself and beyond me, younger than me, have done some really groundbreaking things on their own, and still been a part of the greater organizational movement, right? So, for instance, there was a movement a few years back called the Grassroots Movement. And Grassroots was in essence a group of Messianic Jewish young people, all 20, 30 somethings that were part of the different congregational missional organizations of Messianic Judaism in various ways. A bunch of them were children of Messianic Jewish rabbis or leaders of the missional organizations and so on, that their parents all had bad blood because of whatever had happened in the past, the great Messianic Mafia wars of the 80s and what have you. And so what ended up happening was all of these young people kind of ran into each other at I want to say it was like MLR or something like this, but they ran into each other and they went, "Hey, our parents don't like each other, but why don't we? Like, what's keeping us from liking each other?" And so Grassroots kind of birthed from that, and it was really just 20, 30 somethings from the Messianic movement and various avenues of leadership and or influence in the movement that were getting together and saying, "Hey, our parents' bad blood, our parents' wounds and offenses, we don't need to carry those. So let's just get together, hang out, be in unity, encourage each other, foster relationships and such." And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the movement today is really, I think, birthed from some of that attitude of, let's move past the past and let's move into unity together in the future. Let's let bygones be bygones. Previous generations' bad blood and offenses don't necessarily need to carry on, right? And so I think we've seen to some degree a greater desire of unity. I've been a part of groups where we've got younger Messianic rabbis from different organizations that get together periodically on Zoom or in person or what have you, just to hang out, build relationships, hear from each other, celebrate with each other, pray for each other, what have you, which are things that I haven't seen happen organizationally ever. And so I think, and this is just my take, I think on one hand, a lot of the younger leaders or younger people feeling called into leadership are stagnant and sitting in a place of, well, I guess we've got to wait till the machers die out and we can actually have some footing and be a part of things. But at the same time, on the other side of it, where they can't necessarily get in the mix of things in the grander scale, there's kind of this grassroots thing that's developing where we're all interconnected and fostering relationship and unity despite all of the stuff that's happened in the past, which for me gives me a lot of hope for the future, gives me a lot of hope on what could be on the other side of things. I hate the idea of waiting for the previous generations to die out before we can jump in the mix. I would much rather, as we've talked about on this episode before, on this show before, Rabbi Eric brings up the idea of a relay race, and that there's a point in the race where both the one handing off the baton and the one taking the baton are holding the baton and running together for a season, for a period of time. And I think that there's absolutely a necessity for that running together. But I just don't see enough opportunity for it in a legitimate way. And so personally, I think my personal take is I think the future, though in the moment may look like it could be bleak, I think the reality is a far greater unity is awaiting us on the other side, because the offenses and the wounds and the fears of the past are not being carried on into the future. Or at least hopefully. That's kind of my take and what I'm seeing on it, from being in the mix for a very long time now as a younger leader. I can't really call myself a young leader anymore, but a younger leader.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really watch out for those old fights and not stirring them up. Because again, like you're saying, like most of us who are under the age of 45 were like, I have no personal beef with with you or with anything you've done or said, because we haven't had the opportunity for that to happen. Two, I think a lot of us just understand the degree to which it's how important it is to not fight when we're so few. Because we're not a lot. There's not a lot of us. There's not a lot of Messianic congregations. There's not a lot of Messianic people who are actively involved with the Messianic movement. And even then, like, there's a good percentage of people who are quote unquote involved in the Messianic movement that are like kind of have their foot in both evangelical Christianity and Messianic Judaism. So they're not really fully. We don't have a ton of people who are like 100% committed to Messianic Judaism all in one place, and that's just kind of hard to get. So we understand that, and we're like, oh man, like we need to be making more friends than enemies. A lot of the trivial arguments and behavior patterns and pettiness of the past needs to die away, and not just in the younger generations. Like hopefully, prayerfully, that those who are still fighting with one another will stop fighting with one another over things that can be forgiven and let go of in order to create a better future for Messianic Judaism. Because I'll take the opposite stance for the time being as David. In the what is the potential, I don't want to say like dystopian future of Messianic Judaism, but definitely not the goal of the congregational wing of Messianic Judaism. The congregational wing is what we're all a part of. We're all part of the IMCS, part of the union, and our goal is to create and establish Messianic congregations in cities and states and parts of the particularly where we are in the United States, but also in parts of the world, that not only minister to and provide outreach for non-believing Jewish people, but for anyone who comes through our doors. But again, primarily the goal is to provide a place of evangelistic outreach and of ministry to people who are ethnically Jewish specifically. And again, to anyone who comes through our doors, whether they be Jew or Gentile, it's not. But that's kind of like why this exists. And so in creating those congregations, the goal is to have healthy congregations, what we would all think would be, a healthy sized congregation, sort of in that, 1 to 300, maybe 500, people in attendance or on the books, which takes time. It takes time to grow and to disciple those people and to, establish that foundation in that place where you actually have a footing in your community to have such a presence. And once you have a congregation, it's like, okay, how do we establish good relationships with churches? All of us here, all of our, both congregations here, Bradam and Maimchaim, we all have great relationships with our local churches. And, we get invited to speak at events, to teach on things like Passover, different aspects of Jewish culture, the Jewishness of the New Testament. And all of that takes time and effort to do. And if we succumb to the infighting, if we succumb to the if we disband everything because we're too busy not getting along, then all of that over time disappears. All of it goes away. Because if we're too busy trying to survive internally, then we can't really thrive externally, which means we're not fostering healthy relationships with churches. We're not getting to teach about the Jewishness of Messiah, the Jewishness of the New Testament, to the local Christian community. We're not getting to outreach to the local Jewish community. We're not able to provide those external factors because we're unhealthy internally. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it's like, well, how effective are you? And you might be a philanthropic organization at best, if you're not succeeding in all the other ways. So the future that could be, if a lot of the infighting doesn't stop, if those bad relationships, if that bad blood is not fixed with the future, with the future leaders in Messianic Judaism, you will probably see a lot of congregations disappear, because the fact is, a lot of the infighting and a lot of the fears that have been passed, have been kind of passed into the generation slightly above, our generation, Toby, David, and myself, is that if we get a younger person in here to hire them to teach them to be leaders, there's a possibility they'll split the congregation. There's a possibility like the congregation could like the younger one versus the senior. And we've seen that happen. We know that happens. But that fear has prevented any kind of discipleship from happening towards creating a younger generation. Now, there are attempts now. I know that, I know the union has the, is it U20?
It was K20. It's becoming Kadima, yeah.
Okay, Kadima, yeah.
It's now called Kadima.
Yeah, so there are efforts and attempts. However, if you ask me, I think they are very late in the game. I think there's still a chance they can work and be successful. But again, it just shows that these are becoming afterthoughts. And if those things aren't resolved, then you're not going to have leadership. You're not going to have new leaders to take up. So what does that mean? Leader dies away. Then that means the congregation likely goes away. Not always. Sometimes, elders can come in and do a miraculous, save, but that's, the exception to the rule. And so we will likely, and this is the dystopian future of Messianic Judaism, if the things that need to be fixed within its leadership ranks are not fixed. We will see congregations disappear. We'll have some of the larger, healthier congregations will remain, I'm sure, but you'll see a lot of the smaller congregations, those who are attendance of 50 or below or so, 30, 20 below or so, will disappear over the years. And Messianic Judaism will slowly, just out of a survival instinct, be relegated to more of a educational branch of evangelical Christianity. You'll see Messianic Jewish rabbis and teachers probably on church staffs teaching about the Jewishness of the New Testament, the Jewishness of Messiah. You might have some churches that have a Shabbat service on Friday night to provide for its Jewish believers, those who want to participate in that sort of thing. But that's kind of the dystopia. That's kind of like in my eyes, that's kind of like the worst we could get to. But that will come because already, like if you talk to most Christians about Messianic Judaism, most of them don't even know Messianic congregations exist. Now, a lot of them have heard of groups like FFOZ, and those who are more on the educational wing, like they provide Sunday school material, basically, for groups. So they've heard of those things, and so yeah, that's kind of my vision for. Again, I'm just taking the dystopian stance of if we do not repair and amend, then the congregational wing of Messianic Judaism will slowly fade.
So I think there's, in my opinion, I think there's two specific major hurdles that are necessary for the Messianic Jewish movement as we know it now to be able to survive long term. Right. We have to get over these two specific hurdles. And how that plays out, I can't pretend to speculate on, but I think the first is unity within our own ranks. The organizations themselves, whether they be the congregational organizations or the missional organizations, what have you, we need to actually work together as not necessarily like forsaking our own organizations and making one giant super conglomerate or whatever, but we need to start acting like we're actually supportive of each other, part of the same family.
To stop eating each other.
Exactly. We need to start working in unity with each other. Like, we recognize there's differences between what each's goal is and vision and so on, but that doesn't negate the fact that we're all still together and need to work together and work for the same common goal in mutual benefit rather than fighting against each other. And then the second issue, and I think this is probably something that'll make a launching board for Rabbi Toby. The second issue is I think we need to have a healthier approach to how we involve and include Gentiles in Messianic Judaism as a whole. because I think what's happening is, a significant number of Messianic Jewish congregations have a significant percentage of their community are not Jewish, and that is a beautiful thing when you've got Jews and Gentiles coming together as one, worshiping as one together. I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's amazing. And we have entire generations now of young non-Jewish kids whose families are in Messianic Judaism, and Messianic Judaism is literally the only thing they have ever known.
Right, they're born into it.
And this is their heart, this is their life, this is their vision. And I think a day will come where many of them will yearn for and feel a calling to be involved in Messianic Jewish leadership. And I think that the movement as a whole needs to better dialogue and process through the inclusivity and involvement of Gentiles in the Messianic Jewish movement, in Messianic Jewish leadership, and Messianic Jewish congregations. And I think there's a healthy approach. I think both of our congregations have a healthy approach to this very specific issue. But I think that these two things, unity between the organizations, rather than fighting against each other, and a better way of addressing Jew and Gentile as one, the one new man in Messianic Judaism, are probably the two most vital issues to deal with for procuring a longevity of Messianic Judaism past the pioneer generations.
Right, and not just fighting against, but actually being for.
Yeah.
Because, for example, I know years ago, Rabbi Eric, you had sort of a plan to help develop the idea of future leadership within Messianic Judaism. An intern kind of summer plan for those who were in the latter years of high school and college, those who could go off and afford to be away for a summer, interning under different rabbis, those who felt called to Messianic leadership, whether it be worship leader, rabbi, but kind of focusing on the rabbi aspect. And that it was there were several who did, so it's like yes, we're 100% behind this, but then out of I don't know, hundreds of leaders? Do we even have hundreds of leaders in the Messianic movement? Out of hundreds of leaders, we could not even get 4 to be behind it. I think we got up to 3, and you sent this out to I think both IMCS and Union, and people were just unwilling to invest. And that's the thing, is that it can't just be like, we can't just cease, like David's saying, we can't just cease.
And for the record, it was fully funded. It wasn't even like anybody was asking anybody to put money into it, just to support it.
Just the time. And it's not just the fighting against each other, but we also have to jump behind each other in support.
If you quizzed your congregation, any of us, and asked them who are the big movers and shakers of Messianic Judaism today, how many of them would actually know their names? I mean, honestly, I can tell you.
It's a good question.
I can picture a handful of people in my congregation that I know very well, and I ask them, who's on the steering committee of the IMCS? They don't know. Mm-hmm. Who's the president of the MJA? And that's probably true of your congregation.
Yeah. No, I can ashamedly admit that that's probably the case.
I think I'm making a point that I think that I'm not denying what they've done. I'm just saying their involvement in the day-to-day, week-to-week, which is work of the local congregation, which is where change is made, they don't really have a hand in enough for me to look at them and go, they're part of that they're I don't want to look at them and say that they're a massive part of the problem that's tripping us up. You know what I'm saying? Because I know that in our congregation we're very egalitarian with Jews and Gentiles, but I can look at another congregation and that isn't like that. And I actually had a very, very reputable person in very high leadership look at me and say, there's not really anything we can do with that. It's their local congregation. So if somebody way up there in the tower, for lack of a better term, looks at me and tells me there's not much I can do about that, then we really can't present that as an issue.
Right.
I think you're always going to have that problem. to a degree. I think that I don't know if my viewpoint is as fatalist. I'm not saying that you guys are being fatalist about it.
Sure.
I just know God said He's going to do that as far as the restoration of Israel and the Jewish people saying Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. I mean, I know that God's going to do that, so I don't worry about the. I don't worry about what's going to happen to the congregational movement of Messianic Judaism. I think it will grow. I think it will blow up. I don't know how that's going to look right before Yeshua comes back.
Right.
I want to be careful about inflating just how much influence those guys have on our week to week, which is where we take care of the orphan and the widow, and where we do outreach in our local congregation. And because the fact is that I didn't know who those guys were. When God called me into Messianic Judaism and I wanted to serve the Lord, I didn't know who those guys were until I went to a few conferences and read about them on some brochures and stuff. Right. We don't talk about them every week.
Right. I think what David and I are getting at specifically is not the individuals themselves.
Yeah.
But it's the sentiments in which they have, we've all kind of, the movement has inherited certain sentiments just by default of the fact that they were once at the front. An organization looks like its leaders, especially when they're leaders for 30 or 40 years. I think that's what more.
And I'm not detracting what many of these pioneers have done, and I'm thinking about them in my mind.
Right.
I've met some of them, and and have it's no question.
Right.
I just I don't think about them from week to week when I go into Shabbat service. I'm not I think it's very interesting though. If you really ask and I think a litmus test is asking your congregants, and not telling you to do that. I'm just saying if you did, if you quizzed your congregants on who these people were, most of them don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that part of the conversation is not necessarily the people, but the fact that modern Messianic Judaism was rebirthed when God used a group of people that we call pioneers to start it and get things going, and we're a part of that movement, whether it's Union or IMCS, MJA, all of the different organizations. The question I think that I'm looking at this, the lens I'm looking at this through is, when people were being transported by horse and buggy, everything was going well until the car was invented. And then the people that made the horse and buggies had the option to transition to automobiles or to become extinct. And automobiles still existed and still went on. They were just disconnected from the origins.
Right.
And so, for instance, Sears and Roebuck were the original catalog. I mean, everybody bought things for their home through Sears and Roebuck.
Right.
If any corporation in the world should have been capable of merging into the internet, Sears should have been Amazon before Amazon was Amazon.
Right.
But they weren't willing to change their model from a brick and mortar to a internet and brick and mortar to move that along. So Sears and Roebuck ended up going broke rather than advancing.
Right.
And so my discussion, my thoughts in beginning this wasn't just will we be around. I think we'll be around. Mm-hmm. I think that the fulfillment of what God called Messianic Judaism 2 is going to be there. The question is, will we still be attached in the same way? Will the whole movement as a whole grow?
Right.
Or will part of the movement go by the way of the buggy whip, go by the way of Sears and Roebuck, and the rest of the movement will keep going on? In other words, we honor people like Dr. Stern, who wrote the Complete Jewish Bible and established something that didn't exist, and the mindset of Christians all over the world to think, hey, the Bible's Jewish. And Joel Chernoff and Paul Wilbur and Stuart Dowerman, who began what we know as Messianic Jewish music and the songs that many of us still sing in our congregations, there's this connection to that. But as those leaders cease to be, for whatever reason, will there be a tethered connection to that, or will we, because the movements don't continue moving, because the connection to those leaders don't continue to grow in the new as we go on, will we still be connected? I have full confidence, as you said, Rabbi Toby, that what God promised is going to happen. It's a matter of what that looks like in the future, and will the children and grandchildren of those leaders still be connected to this, or will they hold on to the buggy whip manufacturing while the rest of the world goes on with automobiles, and how we transition to a new environment that is different. As more non-Jews come in, will we still hold on to the us and them mentality within our communities? Will we also still hold on to different aspects of, okay, is this really a messianic song or not? Will we still hold, how are we going to look at these things as we go ahead? Because I want to honor these people that were here before I was here. And I hope that someday people will want to honor whatever contribution I made to the movement and still remain tethered to the movement. But how does that look with what's going on now, when the truth is many of our leaders' children are no longer in the movement? It doesn't mean they're not believers.
Right.
But they're serving in, for instance, I know one very well-known Messianic leader whose son is now working as an assistant pastor in a large, successful congregation. Now, that's not diminishing from that, but that family lineage is in some ways disconnected from the Messianic movement. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying it's different.
Right, and I'm not... I'm sorry. Sorry, Toby.
I just wanted to just qualify that I'm not disrespecting the memory or the accomplishments of any of the
I'm not saying any of us.
No, I didn't say no. I just know that I just didn't want it to come off as me basically saying, who cares? Nobody knows who they are. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm simply warning about inflating just how much they are supposed to be doing. Or for instance, if two organizations have a spat or a fight or a conflict, that shouldn't derail the Messianic movement.
No, absolutely not. And I don't think that's what we're getting at. I think what we're talking about is not so much the fatalistic thing, but I think we're talking about we don't have the hubris to sit here and say, if we don't take the baton and run with it, like, we're not above, like, we're not like in a place where God can't take the baton and give it to someone else.
Right, and I think that part of it, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think part of it is, I think Rabbi Toby brought this out in a way that I'm not sure, anyhow, is the MJA exists, the union exists, our congregations may or may not know any of the leaders of those organizations, and because there's a apparent disconnect from the leadership of the organizations to the local congregation, you can actually feel like you're a separate entity. Instead of being part of, there's Brit Am Messianic Synagogue, which can exist without the MJAA, and I'm not saying I want to, I'm just saying many of our people have never been to a conference. They don't know these people. They don't know the leaders. They don't know what the MJA does other than collect resources and money for outreaches in Israel, things like that.
Yeah, so elections don't necessarily impact them.
Elections don't necessarily impact the in-house congregants. So the 300 to 500 people in our congregations may not feel any attachment to the greater organization, and what began with this group of pioneers. And the more that disconnect exists, the more the separation become real instead of just a thought, and that's my thought in this whole discussion is our congregation. We've been blessed, and I'm not saying this to brag, but we've been blessed. And if the MJA and IMCS were to disappear, and I'm not asking them to do so, our congregation would still be here, and still go on, regardless of what happens with those organizations. We don't want to.
Yeah, I think that's what Toby was getting
that's
at.
exactly what I was getting at. I just think that's a point that needs to be made.
Right, so that's what I'm saying. When you said what you said, I wasn't sure how clearly it came to everybody else.
Exactly. Well, thank you. But it's true.
Yeah, the idea is the four of us sitting at this table don't want that chasm to continue to where the local congregations feel like there's no need for the remnants of the leadership, like the automobile manufacturers didn't need the buggy manufacturers anymore.
And one of the realities to this also is that whether or not people in our congregations directly know the leadership of the organizations or have any real knowledge of the inner workings of the organizations or what have you, the reality is that if we're honest about it today. Now, if we're talking 40, 50 years ago, different story. Today, next to no Messianic congregation would exist in the U.S. without one of the two major congregational organizations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like, whether or not those organizations send people out to plant or not, it's a whole different story. But none of our congregations would exist today if it weren't for the MJ, IMCS, and the UMJC.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, there is absolutely some degree of a disconnect between individuals in our congregation and our organizations and the leadership. And yes, the leadership of the organizations don't have a tremendous sway over the autonomy of the congregation, and the autonomy of the congregation will continue, and so on. And I agree 100% that our congregations are under our leadership and vision on the local level, and so we press on despite whatever may be happening in the peripheral and the organizations and the greater movement. But we also have a responsibility as stewards of what God is doing in the Messianic movement to honor the legacy of what has been established in the modern day Messianic Jewish movement, and to strive to better, in my opinion, to better not only the local communities and congregations, but the organizations, the national, international level of the Messianic Jewish movement. We have an obligation and a responsibility to be stewards of that and to carry that on, because yes, God did something. That something is going to continue with or without the regardless of who's in the seats of power and whatever. But we have a responsibility to steward that still. So that's where some of the ideas that, some of the thoughts that I kind of present and throw out there really comes from, is that idea of there being a responsibility to steward that. And kind of, I think to some degree, though not entirely, and definitely not meant in a slant, but not entirely the heart of the discussion. I think part of this discussion today came from the question that in essence was, will Messianic Judaism survive the pioneer generations? When the pioneers that are still active are gone, will what we know as Messianic Judaism still be around? And to what Rabbi Toby was saying, absolutely. This is a God thing. It keeps going. I say it all the time. Either we believe that Messianic Judaism is an end-time revival that is divinely orchestrated, or we don't. And it's not contingent and hinging upon whether or not one organization or another is doing this, that, or the other, or whatever. But we still have a responsibility to steward what is happening, because, and here's the bottom line, like if you look at the media right now, if you spend any time on social media, and I won't go into which one, there's a specific church in a specific state on the East Coast who the pastor is kind of caught up in some potential ill intent of his wife and her passing and things that are going on there, and it's a pretty messed up story the way things look like it's projecting, whatever. But what's happening is, what's going to happen is all of the people, and we've talked about it before, like when we talked about the which Rabbi Toby's brought up a number of times, the Mars Hill stuff, from the podcast about it. The reality is there were a lot of lives that were tremendously and dynamically impacted by God because of that ministry.
Right.
But none of those are part of the story anymore. Right. Because the thing that took the lead of the story was how terribly things panned out and how bad things went and how destructive things were. And that's going to be the same case in this church, and that's going to be the same case in a number of things. And so my heart is, I don't want it to ever be that what is remembered is the terrible bad blood between the IMCS MJ or the MJ and the MJC, or the bad blood between the congregation and the missional organizations, or this or that. I want what people to remember as the legacy of Messianic Judaism. And I think this is important because I think this is why the pioneers did what they did in the first place.
Right.
I want what people remember of the Messianic Jewish movement to be the impact, the lasting and dynamic impact that we had on the lives of Jews and Gentiles for the kingdom of Messiah, and on the body of Messiah in bringing back the Jewish context of Yeshua.
And I think that as we wrap this episode up, it may be that we want to do a second episode on what we think can be done to reconnect, not like reconnect the Union and the IMCS necessarily, or Chosen Peoples and Jews for Jesus, or the missional and the other, but what can we do to connect our individual congregations in a greater way to the greater body, not any organization individually, but as Rabbi Toby said, if we asked our congregants who's the president of the Union, or who's the president of the IMCS, or who's the leader of Jews for Jesus, or who's the leader of Chosen People, many of them wouldn't be able to answer that question. And maybe as leaders, we need to do a little more to make that connection, to expand upon that, and to lead people to a connection with the greater body. And we do in a small way, because we attend both IMCS conferences and union conferences and the Jewish Voice outreaches and different things that we support. But maybe there's things we can do, and maybe we can talk about that in another episode, the positive things we can do that would connect the average congregant to the greater movement, so that we can maybe, at least in a small way within our congregations, and maybe other leaders in other congregations would do the same.
Before we wrap up, though, I do want to double back to what Rabbi Toby was talking about, and say that, a lot of times, especially for me, anybody that's listened to podcasts long enough knows that I can have a rather pessimistic view of things sometimes, and I'm really good at that. But the reality is, I have experienced and witnessed a lot of the crazy that happens in the Messianic Jewish movement, and there's definitely a bit of a jilted attitude that I have to some of the greater movement, the things that happen in the greater movement as a whole. But I think Rabbi Toby does definitely hit something on the nail on the head a bit there with the, hey, some of this stuff's happening, but it doesn't negate from what's really happening in the local community, which is the heart of the movement to begin with.
Right.
And so, we've talked about it a lot in our own internal conversations in our congregation, is despite what happens in the organizations, we're going to keep doing what we do and what God is leading us to do in our community, and continue to be faithful to what God is doing. And hopefully, if it's His will, at some point somebody will go, hey, something you're doing is working. Can you come, give us some pointers? Can you give some tips? Can you show us how this is happening for you, and how it can be maybe multiplied or continued on in our work, or what have you? Have some opportunity to be involved in influential places, to see the movement go to where it's supposed to be long term. I know personally I'm beyond thankful for the blood, sweat, and tears that the pioneers have put into this. And
Absolutely.
I desire for nothing more than to be a steward of what they've already established, and to see it carry on into what the next phase of the modern Messianic Jewish movement truly is.
Again, I'm with David. I want to see the legacy of those who started this thing live on, and that means we have work to do. That means we have to put effort into getting along, supporting each other, educating our congregations on the national movement, the bigger, the collective. Because again, like I was saying, I don't have the hubris to sit here and say we're the only ones that can do it, because again, if we believe things are a movement of God, God will do it with or without us. And Yeshua Yeshua comes to the Jewish leadership in the first century and tells them, "You're not worthy of the kingdom, so I'm going to give it to those for whom it is worthy." And he takes it from the Jewish leadership and gives it to the Jewish apostles. And so I'm not above thinking that if we don't succeed, God will succeed with someone else.
So we will probably have a continuing conversation on this in a future episode. If you have some thoughts on how the local congregations can be better connected and more encouraged toward the larger organizations, to build better ties between them, to introduce them greater to those organizations as individual organizations, because the organizations have a purpose in the greater move. We ask that you'll put those comments in the comment areas of whichever one of these podcasts sources you're listening to, or on our social media, and we'll try to connect with that in a future episode. Thanks for listening. I hope it's been a blessing, and if it has been, I hope you'll share it with others. Like, subscribe, and follow us.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.